Now, earlier today, the trailer for the second and final season of the animated show Star Wars Resistance dropped, a link to which will be found in the description below if you want to check it out. And yeah, you did hear me right, I did say the final season of the show because it will be ending after just 2 seasons, and despite the fact it recently got nominated for an Emmy. Though, honestly, I can't say I'm all that surprised by this news. As I mentioned in a video just the other day, this was likely going to be the case, that the show was likely going to be cancelled considering at San Diego Comic-Con, Hasbro said they had no future plans to make any more toys based on the show. And well, part of the game plan with a show like Resistance is to sell toys to kids. Hell, if growing up in the 80s taught me anything at all, it's that cartoons exist pretty much just to sell toys to kids. In fact, they're just one giant commercial. Anyway, if you've seen any of my other videos on Resistance in the past, you'll know I wasn't a huge fan of the show. And if you do like it or even love it, hey, that's cool. To each their own. As I like to say, I'll respect your opinion if you respect mine. And personally, I just thought Season 1 was pretty dull and only had some okay to good episodes here and there, though it ended with at least a decent season finale that overlapped with the events of The Force Awakens, which I thought was pretty cool. But by and large, I just wasn't a huge fan of it. And yes, I know the usual argument some will want to make, that it's a show aimed primarily at children and I'm a grown-ass man and clearly not the target audience. However, to give my usual disclaimer when talking about this show, I'm reviewing it and discussing it as an adult for other adult fans who may or may not want to see it or have seen it and also want to discuss it. I'm also mainly comparing it against the previous Star Wars animated shows, which I would argue had broader appeal or were at least somewhat aimed at older fans. And what I'm not saying here is that this show wouldn't or couldn't be enjoyed by the younger crowd that it is clearly intended for. But all that said, it doesn't appear that the younger crowd actually got on board with this show, hence the poor toy sales, which led to Hasbro saying they're done making them after just one wave of action figures. And now the show's cancellation confirms this just wasn't getting the audience or generating the revenue to justify more seasons. Though, as I also brought up in that video the other day, it's hard to know what's the biggest problem Star Wars toys face today. Is it fewer kids overall playing with action figures in the age of technology? Or is it kids just not all that interested in Star Wars in the first place? There's also the collector aspect, and they do make up at least a sizable percentage of the marketplace. And as a collector myself, I can tell you, many of my fellow collectors have little to no interest in the sequel trilogy era. And they have even less interest in paying for action figures from a childish show set in that time period. Nevertheless, even though collectors do make up a decent share of the marketplace, the bulk of the buyers are still kids or parents buying them for their kids. And even though I think it is the case that overall less kids these days play with action figures, there are still plenty of kids that do play with them or do want them. Though my guess is that when they're in the store, it's not Star Wars figures they're pointing at and begging their parents for, it's Marvel figures, which, yeah, is still kind of a win for Disney overall. And no, this isn't the part of the video where I laugh and say I told you the show would fail and proclaim Star Wars is dying and say that kids these days hate it. Rather, this is where I say this is pretty depressing news on multiple fronts. Because even though I wasn't a huge fan of the show, though mind you, I thought the new trailer looked decent and I'll talk more about it in a bit. Again, I wasn't the target audience, clearly. And if kids were loving Resistance, then so be it. I'm more than okay with that. In fact, I'd be happy if this had been a massive success with the younger generation. My disappointment with the show stemmed from the fact that I think Lucasfilm can and has done better. Even Lucasfilm under Disney has done better with these animated shows. As I've said before, I think Rebels walked that fine line between being too childish for adults and too mature for kids pretty well. I think it was a show that the whole family could sit down and watch and enjoy together, or even an adult fan could sit down and watch it all by their lonesome self and still enjoy it and these characters. However, I didn't get that vibe from Resistance. It didn't try to walk the line and instead felt far more skewed towards children than adults. And I know, some of you will want to take to the comments and tell me you sat down and watched Resistance with your children and you all loved it. And honestly, I do think that's fantastic. I'm glad you got to share Star Wars with your kids like that. But it seems like other parents and or kids didn't do the same thing. Nor did a lot of those fans without kids sit down and watch it. Some of which are collectors who also didn't buy the toys, which is why I'd argue it might be unwise to make a show strictly aimed at the youngest of viewers only. The other reason that this is sad news is it makes me wonder about the future of Star Wars animation, which, in my opinion, has offered us some terrific content over the years, and even some of the greatest moments in all of Star Wars. Are there plans for a new show already, or, like with the movies, should we expect a bit of a break before we get anything new? which seems unlikely considering past success with these shows, because you certainly don't want to give up on trying to hook the younger generation on Star Wars, and a cartoon like this on a cable channel is a good way to try and do it, so I wouldn't expect a long absence in this department. Another thing to keep in mind here is we have Season 7 of The Clone Wars coming, and if that's well received, and it likely will be, and it spikes subscription numbers for Disney Plus when it arrives, it could very well mean we'll get another animated show on that service, or maybe even more seasons of The Clone Wars, which they could call The Untold Stories of the Clone Wars, or something like that, considering Season 7 will take us to the end of the actual Clone Wars, so to call it Season 8 might be a bit odd. Either way, no matter how you want to spin it, this is a bad sign for Star Wars, because you have to keep in mind with an animated show like this, Season 2 was no doubt in the works before Season 1 even debuted. In other words, sure, this is getting a second season, but it essentially got cancelled after just one. You then have to factor in the recent low attendance at Disneyland in the wake of the opening of Galaxy's Edge, and well, I don't want to say the sky is falling by any stretch, but these aren't good signs. This isn't screaming that kids are falling in love with Star Wars these days. But before I end up diving into that topic again, let me briefly give you my thoughts on the trailer itself. And as I said a few moments ago, I thought it looked pretty good. Not great or anything, but certainly good. I'm not suddenly counting the days until the premiere of the new season, but yes, I will watch it. Though I do read and watch everything in the canon, so that's not saying a whole lot, I suppose. And there were some things in the trailer that I found anywhere from curious and interesting to rather head-scratching. Like, why is the First Order even bothering to chase the Colossus at this point? The trailer implies they're hell-bent on finding it, and it's of the utmost importance, but I really can't figure out why. Is it really because there's a handful of resistance on it? Because The Last Jedi tells us that the First Order now reigns over the galaxy, that they basically took it over or were in the process of doing just that. Rey even tells Luke that all the major systems will have fallen within weeks. But what ships are they actually doing that with? What ships are they using to take everything over? I mean, if right after the destruction of Starkiller Base, you've got a massive fleet of Star Destroyers chasing after just 3 Resistance ships, and maybe a Star Destroyer or 2 chasing after the Colossus now, just how many ships do they have? How did the First Order keep this giant fleet a secret from the New Republic? Why were they so ill-prepared to take on the remnants of the Empire that they had worked so hard to overthrow initially? Also, why is the First Order so interested in capturing the Colossus when it's running out of fuel? What good is a refueling station that doesn't have any fuel? I'm also starting to wonder if Lucasfilm these days can't figure out how to craft a Star Wars story that doesn't revolve around fuel, because it looks like having to find some fuel will be a big plot point this season. I was also surprised to see Captain Phasma in the trailer, considering she died again in The Last Jedi. I mean, sure, her appearance in the show is likely happening before she dies in that movie. I'm not suggesting she survived episode 8, but there's such a small window there, considering the last season of Resistance ended during the events of The Force Awakens, that I can't imagine she'll be in anything but a handful of episodes at most. Anyway, sorry about that little tangent. Getting back to the trailer, there were some cool things in it. We got to see the Crimson Corsair, though you'll only know him as the guy Finn almost joined up with in The Force Awakens, unless you've read the book The Crimson Corsair and the Lost Treasure of Count Dooku. And the treasure actually is, spoiler alert here, a clone trooper named Kix, who is alive and well in the time period of the sequel trilogy. And it'd be cool to get to see him in the show and to hear D. Bradley Baker at it again, doing a voice of a clone trooper. And that clone trooper could then go on to help deal with the B-2 battle droids we also see in this trailer. Perhaps the most interesting part of it, though, at least in terms of the lore, is towards the end of it when we see what looks like some type of, well, it almost looks like a holocron, but it seems to get referred to as a power source from an ancient time. And the symbols we see look very similar to the symbols we see around the portals in the world between worlds. It also seems like it might involve those kids from the first season and why their home planet was destroyed. And it also may be something that Kylo Ren is looking for, and he does show up in the last clip from the trailer. Other than that, there's a lot of action in this trailer, and it certainly makes the show look better than that original trailer we got made it look, which is probably a big part of this show's problem. That first trailer turned a lot of people off right at the start. A lot of people just never bothered to tune in at all and even give it a chance, which I would say would have a lot to do with 2 things: the childish air it initially gave off, and the fact that some people just don't like or care about the sequel trilogy era. Either way, I do hope this season is good, and not just because I, as a canon junkie, will be watching it one way or the other. I hope that what I personally saw as a slow Season 1 was just a gradual build-up to something much bigger and better, that, for better or worse, will now be cut way short. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of the trailer for Season 2 of Resistance, and are you surprised it's coming to an end already? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.